Welcome to the Mindful Dietitian podcast. I'm Fiona Sutherland, body-inclusive non-diet dietitian and yoga teacher from Melbourne, Australia, and director of the Mindful Dietitian. Please join me as I have important conversations with dietitians and health professionals from all over the world about getting brave and leaning into tough conversations as we cultivate a strong community of practitioners committed to body-inclusive practice. We'll talk about mindfulness, we'll dig into diet culture, and we'll explore ways of bringing courageous and important topics into our professional spaces so we can more deeply understand our own experience and make our work more meaningful. Thank you for joining me.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to this next episode of the Mindful Dietitian podcast, where this time I'm speaking with Safeena Jabar and Gurneet Dhami. This is a well overdue conversation about equity, inclusion and justice in dietetics, healthcare and beyond. So I'm coming to you today and every day from Wurundjeri country in Southeast Australia. I respectfully acknowledge Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Island peoples of the many lands of the Kulin Nation and beyond as traditional owners and custodians of Australia. I acknowledge the wisdom of elders both past and present and pay my respects to the communities of today. I recognise and acknowledge that First Peoples of Australia have an ongoing and deep-seated connection to land and culture and value their unique contribution to both us and the wider society. In Australia, sovereignty has never been ceded, and Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am incredibly thrilled to be sharing this conversation with you today with Safeena and Gurneet as they share what justice means to them. We talk about white privilege and how it can manifest in healthcare. We talked about the calling in of Dietitians of Canada, which is the national dietetics organisation in Canada, how it came about, and current developments, and then move on to Gurneet and Safeena's hopes for more diversity within the profession. We also discussed the extension of Diversify Dietetics USA into Canada, the need for new health at every size and weight-inclusive frameworks to ensure consideration of race, ethnicity and culture, and how we can begin to make our practice more inclusive right now. So a little bit about my guests. So Safeena Jabar is a dietetic intern completing her master's degree in nutrition communication at Ryerson University in Toronto. After a turbulent time navigating nutrition information in her adolescence, Safeena committed to becoming a registered dietitian in order to gain a deeper scientific understanding of nutrition and the body. She aims to provide a safe space for clients to discuss their goals and concerns while dispelling common myths. She's passionate about working with people to improve and maintain their wellness from an anti-diet, health at every size informed approach. Safeena has a special interest in the impact of food on well-being based on her knowledge of complex historical and institutional factors that have shaped our food landscape. Health and social inequities persist through these systems, so Safeena is advocating for change through educating and empowering her fellow healthcare practitioners, local community and national organisations to ensure a future where all people have equitable access to appropriate healthcare. Gurneet Kaur Dhami is a Southeast Asian Sikh woman travelling between Toronto to Halifax, where she is completing a Masters in Science in Applied Human Nutrition at Mount St Vincent University. Her emerging thesis work focuses on the experience of racialised dietitians navigating dietetics using critical race theory. Gurneet is both a researcher and social activist, as she partakes in food justice work by working on food security projects and being involved in the student food movement. As a youth leader, she hopes to further dialogue on race, reconciliation and equity beyond our kitchen tables. To find out more about what the Mindful Dietitian is about, including supervision, training, networking, and of course, this podcast and other episodes, head on over to the website, www.themindfuldietitian.com.au. So thank you so much for being here and sharing in these really important conversations, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to the Mindful Dietitian podcast. It is such a pleasure to welcome you both, Safeena and Gurneet, two incredible dietetic students from Ontario in Canada. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us, Fiona. It's an honor to be on here.
I can't wait to dive into lots of conversations. Hey, Gurneet.
Hello from, I was going to say out east, but now I'm also back in Ontario.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, well, it's a vast country, so I want to kind of position where you are geographically in the world. So, Safeena, I wanted to start with handing over to you. I understand you have some introductions that you would like to make, so I'm just going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Fiona. Before we get into the podcast today, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So Gurneet and I are both located in Vaughan, Ontario, which is a little bit north of Toronto. And so as settler women, we acknowledge the sacred, unceded, stolen land which we're situated upon. And the purpose of this acknowledgement is to remember the true history of how Canada came to be and the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples, including cultural genocide, theft of natural resources, and deception to acquire lands. As I mentioned, we're both located in Vaughan, which is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Métis Nation that was taken under the Toronto Purchase Treaty No. 13. These are the traditional lands where Indigenous groups live, hunt, and gather, connect with each other and the world and beings around them. Additionally, the community where we reside is the namesake of an enslaver, and we are actively participating to decolonize this locally through activism work. The impacts of colonialism are sustained today with the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people, police brutality, housing and employment discrimination, lack of access to clean drinking water, nutritious food, and loss of language and cultural practices. In our efforts to advocate for social justice in dietetics, we must honor the Indigenous lives lost and the hardships they endured, and continually do so, and we must be active in our commitment towards reconciliation. Our commitment to reparations is lifelong through actively combating anti-Indigenous racism, working with Indigenous communities in our professional capacity, and dismantling the systems of oppression that continue to perpetuate injustice. We encourage you to reflect on this acknowledgement, what it means to you, and how we can move forward with reconciliation, because we are all treaty people.
Thank you so much, Safeena. That acknowledgement of land and of peoples and of culture is really critical to the work that we are bringing into dietetics. The two cannot be separated in so many ways. So I really appreciate the depth and breadth that you went to really give our listeners an idea of how the land and the way in which cultures and food practices and food sovereignty has been stolen, and what that's got to do with us being dietitians. So that really sets the scene. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank
so
you.
I wanted to start off with maybe asking you, Gurneet, about why does justice mean so much to you? How have you kind of come to be really, you have invested a lot of time and energy and your studies into justice. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so when I even think about the word, and there is obviously like a lot of imagery that comes into place, like a fist and things like that, marching, but also it can be something that is day to day in workplaces and schools and settings that it takes on different forms, and it's for different people for sure. And when I think about myself being in dietetics, I think I always found myself taking a step outside of the profession, because when you are just in the same field talking about the same things, there does happen to be that group think, and you think this is the best thing that you're a part of. It's only until you don't know that you're going to hear about the problems and things that aren't working from people outside. When everyone's inside, there is that group thing. So I often find myself in places that are maybe in like political scenes, end up being more social activism, I guess, in the Toronto area where I was brought up. And when I brought up food stuff, there's a lot of things that I couldn't talk about because it wasn't stuff I talked about in the class. And I'm like, I don't know these other intersections. Racial justice, what does that look like? Food insecurity, that's something I've dove into more. And yeah, thinking about like, yeah, why doesn't everyone have, we all have the right to food, but why doesn't everyone have food? And I would say more so I take in thinking about dietetics in my thesis work, specifically into racial justice. And that comes from like a personal place as well. Thinking about like, yeah, hearing things that I'm not going to fit in and thinking about what does it mean to fit in. Size is one thing, but then your skin color is another, right? So I think that's what it alluded to in the beginning. And then just taking that comment and really drove home for me. And going into my master's, I always wanted to do research. So I was looking more at culture, but I'm like, yeah, what does a profession look like? How do we understand ourselves? And quickly I came to learn that by the limited research that we do have and what we do know is that it is a pretty white dominated female profession here in Canada. And like elsewhere, just hearing like the comments and connections that I hear in like the States and like also the UK and Australia, like a lot of people are bringing this forward. And I also want to point out that it's not being white that's the problem, it's how whiteness and how, yeah, these dominant ideologies kind of take how do they play out in the classroom, in the curriculum, in the ways we eat, like what is the reference point and of being healthy. And it always comes back to being white and Eurocentric ways of eating. So that's something I've been trying to work on. And it's hard because when you're talking to diverse groups and like racially, ethnically, multiculturalism and Indigenous groups, I don't see myself a part of this profession or that kind of where are our people, and they do exist. And it's just understanding why, I guess just understanding like the environment, like why is there a lack of, or again, I don't have data, but based on what I do know, there is a lack, and that's what I'm trying to get. And it's like, why haven't we thought about this? And I think the huge number one question that always comes up is like, why is it now? Racialized people existed before 2020. A lot of these issues existed before. Why now? So I think that's where that really comes from. And also I kind of wanted to, maybe now is also a good time to just put a disclaimer out there. Just adding on to Safeena doing the land acknowledgement and also acknowledging like, yeah, for everyone to think about, yeah, your position on the land, your relationship and settler colonialism and how you choose to decolonize. That's really important. And also like, we aren't experts. We are just talking from our lived experience and our journey thus far, being like professionally socialized in dietetics. And we are also vulnerable in our position, and we haven't attained our dietetic like title yet. And yeah, like I expect that there will be repercussions. There always are repercussions of some sort. And that's sad to say. And as racialized women, that's something that we've dealt with in our life and it continues to happen. So yeah, we also are mindful. We may make mistakes and may have missteps and just ask to be called in or called out to address this and not further put trauma on equity seeking groups and ask for space to heal and respect like that capacity as well. So just important to put that out there because yeah, sometimes things get said and sometimes we don't know where things are leading, but I think that just comes from like the need to have these conversations, and it's great that we can have this conversation here, and we hope more people and places are inviting conversations like this because they're long overdue.
Yeah, not only are they long overdue, but I really appreciate your points around missteps and making mistakes and being willing to lean into not only the possibility that will happen, but the fact that will happen. It's not an if, it's a when. And the courage that it takes to show up for important conversations that can move the needle in terms of inclusion and equity and justice across the board, but for marginalized folks being at the center, it's we're all going to mess it up. And if we can hold each other in a space where we can be courageous and compassionate whilst also not letting each other off the hook, then hopefully we can continue, going from strength to strength. And this is certainly a profession where we need to be digging in and doing some really, really decent work. So thank you so much, Gurneet. That sets us up really, really nicely, because I really want to loop back to you and ask more about your research, which is absolutely fascinating. So we'll loop back to that. But Safeena, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what justice means for you, and how the kind of trajectory that has led you to having such an interest in social justice, and in particular food justice.
Thanks, Fiona. So, as Gurneet mentioned, we're still both learning and unlearning, and it's a lifelong process. And so I do encourage the listeners, if I say something that's offensive or incorrect, I welcome your constructive feedback, because I know intent versus impact, and I absolutely do not want to be stepping on anyone with the work that I'm doing. And so the whole reason why I got into social justice more recently, it was always a value of mine, but I didn't know how to act on it. And when it really started is when Gurneet and I connected through a mutual colleague at Ryerson. And Gurneet would sort of ask me really hard questions, and it forced me to think about my positionality and the work that I was doing. Did I want to be like other dietitians, or did I want to be my own brand of dietitian? Did I want to be Safeena the dietitian? And so with that, there's two main reasons why I think I got into social justice. The first being my character and values. So ever since I was little, my family members will be able to tell you I'm very outspoken, empathetic. So if someone's hurting, I hurt with them. And if I see something that's, wrong or oppressing someone else, you can bet that I will speak out about it. And so I always had that respect and acceptance, for all people and their differences. And the second factor is that I believe social justice is in my DNA. I would be doing my ancestors and my family members a great disservice if I didn't actively resist and speak out about injustice. And the explanation for this is sort of rooted in my family history of how we arrived to Canada. It's a little bit heavy, I do forewarn you. But long story short, my great-great-grandparents are from Hindustan, which is now India. And they were brought to the colony of Guyana, which is located in South America. And they were indentured laborers. So indentured servitude was born out of the need to fill gaps for cheap labor in the colony, as Africans were, quote unquote, emancipated from enslavement. And so my ancestors were deceived into migrating through the false promise that they would receive compensation, that they would be free, and that they would be able to return back home at any time. And so when they arrived, they realized that it was a very different reality, and the plantation owners effectively held my ancestors' lives in their hands. And so they didn't really have the option to resist, because if they did, it would be life or death for them. And so this complacency and culture of silence was passed down from generation to generation, and also sort of shapes my identity as well. But it's the reason why I do the work that I do, because I know I want to have a positive impact. And even if I can help one person, that's all that matters to me. And so because of my family's histories and the privileges that I'm afforded as a second-generation Canadian Indo-Guyanese Muslim woman, as one of the few people in my family who has pursued university education and only the second to pursue a master's degree, I have a level of privilege that many people in the world don't. I have the education and the resources in order to seek out research and tools in order to support my work. I have the words to articulate our experiences and a platform, and therefore I have the power to have people listen to me. And so for me, these privileges are an extreme amount of power, and therefore it's up to me to use it responsibly. So for me, using this power responsibly is doing social justice work.
Wow. Thank you so much. I received those words so gratefully. And when you were talking about you as a younger child and then your family history and your ancestry, I was able to put the pieces of the puzzle together. It all makes so much sense as to why Safeena the dietitian will undoubtedly be taking a position of you're so fierce and determined, and I can see exactly why and how your DNA has led you to this point. And we are so glad you're here, both of you. Thank you so much. It's a true honor and a pleasure to be speaking with you, and to be following your careers, which is going to be incredible over time. It really will be. So thank you, Safeena. I really appreciate you stepping us through that. Gurneet, I was wondering if it felt okay to just give us a little bit of a shape to this conversation. So, in justice circles, in social justice circles, we speak a lot about, there are some words that we commonly come back to. So words like privilege, words like oppression. Safeena spoke about power and supremacy as well. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind stepping us through some of the more common words that we might be using today, or that people might read or hear about, that might be helpful just to explain a little bit, so that we're all kind of on the same page and understanding what it is we're actually talking about here.
Yeah, for sure. And I know Safeena can definitely add on to this as well, as she has. I know we were talking about this before, and I'm like, Safeena, I feel like I always have to pop open my thesis and I'm working on things in between. And then, yeah, when also it's important to recognize, when you are doing this work in anti-racism and being racialized, there is a lot of that burden that's put on you, and it's that emotional labor. So I feel like that's why sometimes I don't reopen things, or I choose to I'll do my interviews I'm doing right now and leave it for a while just to process things. But yeah, you're so a part of your research in that aspect. And yeah, these are things even words that have even come up, talking to people, and it's more, I think it's gone to the point where we should know what they mean. And when I think about, white privilege, for just to start off with, that's something that we can dive more into with Peggy McIntosh. There's also the invisible knapsack, and that's an activity individuals can do. And when I first came across this word and referencing in my thesis, it says 1988. That's a long time ago, but not so long ago as well. And just kind of what Peggy McIntosh kind of defines it as is the unearned advantage based on race. And yeah, that can be seen on an individual and systematic level, and when you think about social, economic, and political realms of society. And also the concept of white privilege is an outcome from how whiteness and white supremacy not only name aesthetics, but also associate positive values for being white. So this is more other scholars pointing this out, and that's where it's not until you see an infographic or an image. So I really suggest to people to follow, or if you haven't seen that pyramid image by The Conscious Kid, that's a great illustration of how white supremacy can be seen in society. And yeah, so I think, Safeena, if you wanted to add on more to taking the deep dive into white supremacy.
Yeah, so just to add to that, Black scholars actually wrote about racial privilege before Peggy McIntosh had officially coined the term, but that's a different issue for a different podcast. And so when she originally wrote it, it was for white privilege and for male privilege. And now it's expanded into a variety of intersectional identities. So we're looking at national privilege, linguistic privilege based on sexual orientation, gender and gender identity, our abilities, physical and mental, our religion, having a passing privilege. So appearing white, but you're actually from another culture. Even class privilege, and all of these different types of privilege sort of mingle and form ultimately who you are. And so this is the reason why I did an IGTV a few months ago about unpacking that privilege. And so a lot of people, it feels icky to kind of talk about, because it's like, I had to work hard to get to where I am today. It's unfair to say that I had a privilege, which is why I talked about my own experiences, because I don't want people to feel like I'm saying, you're bad, you need to do the work, because I need to do the work as well. And so in terms of discussing how privilege sort of manifests in healthcare, I'll provide this example. There's always the power dynamic between the healthcare practitioner and the client or patient. And no matter how much we try to apply that client-centered care model, we can't negate the fact that there always will be that power dynamic there. And so when I think about privilege, I think about the way that my grandparents were treated. They have, like many people of South Asian descent, type 2 diabetes, and my grandmother has glaucoma. And so they had a optometrist at one point who they weren't able to identify why her eye pressure was so high. And basically he just attributed, oh, this is common for Indian people, and that's it. He didn't prescribe her medication, no counseling, no education, which was very racist in a sense, because he just attributed it to their color and their origins, so to speak. So with that, they ended up leaving that optometrist and finding another optometrist who actually was able to diagnose it as glaucoma. And so we have to that's why it's very important for us as healthcare practitioners to be aware of our own privileges, because then we put that onto our clients and they're not equipped to deal with that. Most people don't have that level of health literacy to advocate for themselves and to say, no, I know what I'm talking about and I demand this, this, and this.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love the way that you brought this into the kind of practical, and thank you so much for sharing that personal experience too of your grandmother's eye condition, which was essentially was misdiagnosed and therefore had significant impact on her well-being, undoubtedly. So what I wanted to just briefly loop back on was what you mentioned, Safeena, about power structures in the health practitioner and client or patient setting, because what I really appreciated in you talking about in client-centered practice or patient-centered practice, that we can't ignore that power structures and power inequity exists, and in doing so, in trying to ignore it and kind of lean into equity, there's a part of me that wonders whether we actually do more harm in that way, rather than simply acknowledging that these power structures do exist and maintaining ethical client-centered care, which really prioritizes and centers the lived experience of the person sitting in front of us. Because I think if we try to fake the idea that we're all equal, we're actually ignoring the fact that in these kind of systems, we're actually not. And I was offering this example the other day just to a supervisee of mine. I was saying, if we, for example, had a knee injury and we go to see an orthopedic surgeon, let's just say for some specialist care, no matter how much the surgeon is really trying to make us feel at ease and is really listening to us and taking a really great history and really paying attention, etc., etc., we know that they are the person who could possibly be doing surgery on our knee. So no matter how much somebody tries to, close that gap, so to speak, of inequity of power structures, we still know it's in our body that this person is the person who's potentially going to be, offering us medication, treatment, referrals, etc., etc. So I appreciated you bringing that back to the practical, because that's something that we really need to remember.
Absolutely.
So this is something that I can't wait to hear your thoughts on. A few months ago, the two of you co-wrote to Dietitians of Canada. It was a personal statement, and it was extraordinary. And with your permission, I'd really like to share it in the notes of this podcast. I know you shared it across social media, but just to, provide that additional, ask additional permission for that, I'll just want to check in on that. So I'm really curious to hear about how this statement kind of came about. And so telling us a little bit about the statement and I guess your hopes for how Dietitians Canada and maybe dietetics more broadly, more globally, might examine issues of power and privilege within our profession.
Yeah, so there was the annual Dietitians of Canada conference that occurred, and there was some discussion among the dietetic community about the lack of diversity in the presenters who were going to be speaking at the conference. And this kind of started out of the video that I posted actually on privilege. It was reshared on the Dietitians of Canada page, but I didn't know that until Gurneet told me, because I didn't follow them at the time. They didn't ask for my permission to share it, and I wasn't tagged in it, so I had no idea that this was going on. And at first I was super excited because I'm like, wow, this is amazing. The national organization is sharing my stuff, but I'm like, wait, it's a little bit deeper than that. And so I wanted to use this opportunity while I had their attention to bring sort of light to the lack of diversity and inclusion within the organization itself. And this sort of led to a back and forth between us and just more frustration, I think on both ends, that we weren't really being heard. So ultimately, Gurneet and I decided to pen our own letters because Gurneet has had her own interactions with DC. I'm less familiar with the organization. I'm not a member and such. So I had a different perspective. Mine was more related to the sharing of my content and why they wouldn't. It's not enough to just share things that you think resonate with your social justice values. You need to be actively involved in it. So it was like me doing a call-in to try and get them to say, okay, we need to do more work on the diversity piece for Dietitians of Canada. So we co-wrote a letter. I wrote my own, and I really wanted them to understand the impact, because what commonly happens, and Gurneet will also touch on this, is that people of color don't get fairly compensated for the work that they do. So I mean, I'm still growing. I'm not a dietitian yet. And so I was just happy for the exposure. But Gurneet's like, wait, that's very problematic. Like, you took the time. I took a lot of time to sit and think with this and reflect and develop the ideas that I discussed in the video. And so I thought, yeah, you know what? If they're paying their executive members, I should be compensated as well. Ultimately, we've been notified that it's a volunteer organization, which is fair enough. But the executives do get a very nice salary out of things. And so it's unfair that they're sharing the work of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are often in more I'm very careful about the way I use this, vulnerable positions, because they're more likely to face backlash when they do this kind of thing. And so contacting Dietitians of Canada was something that doesn't really have, not that it doesn't have repercussions for our career, but they're not the licensing board. So if we were to come after the licensing board, that would be a completely different conversation. We're much more cautious about that. We still have careers to build, and we don't want to be blacklisted, so to speak.
So just to check with you, so your licensing board is different from your registration board. So there's Dietitians Canada, and then you get your license through a separate organisation.
Yeah, so each province and territory has their own licensing board. For us, it's the College of Dietitians of Ontario. And Dietitians of Canada is a voluntary organization, so it's not mandatory for you to be a part of the organization. It's just a nice professional area where they share all sorts of resources and do conferences and share ideas, that sort of thing.
Thank you. The reason why I wanted to clarify that is because in other organisations, I'll give you an example of Dietitians Australia, it all exists in one. So you get registered, you get everything is all in one. So it's kind of risky to be speaking up to an organisation that actually holds your licence in the same hand, and can cut you off from being able to see clients privately. Yeah, so I just wanted to stop there and just clarify, because I think different organisations work in different ways, and therefore shapes our capacity or our ability to be able to really step in there. And so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Gurneet, could you tell us a little bit more about the personal statement? It was, quite extraordinary. So over to you.
Yeah, I'm just, I think, what Safeena mentioned as well. It's interesting. Like, yeah, there's different tiers and like dietetic groups, organizations nationwide. Like the States is quite big, and they have like a lot of different organizations and groups going on. And yeah, I guess just to like clarify, even with Dietitians of Canada, that's like the professional face of like when you think about Dietitian of Canada. So like there's that, and different colleges, regulatory colleges, and then there's like also PDEP, so partnership, that kind of looks at our competencies and things like that. So there's like a lot of structures and hierarchy for sure. So it really depends on who you're trying to contact and what you're trying to get across. But yeah, the reason like with Dietitian of Canada is because that's the name that you would see, and that's the association you would first associate with dietitians. And just like how there's a medical association, nursing association. So like, even like speaking from my own experience, I am a member, and I've been one just, more so throughout my master's, because there is that, I don't know how this whole accreditation works, because we do need to be members to do our certain courses online, and I'm still not fully familiar, but I know I kind of have to be a member based on my program too. So that's even things that it's kind of in a way put on you. You can probably dispute that. So we'll see what happens with that as well. But yeah, so just even thinking about my own interaction has been more so over the last 3 years. So getting to the master's, and I've posted something recently, just kind of in a way receipts of like me talking to different people, whether I was in Nova Scotia where I study, or in Ontario where I kind of went for my internship, and just being here. So I kind of document, like, I went to an event. I said, what about diversity? Oh yeah, we're looking at diverse roles. So, okay. And then I kind of say, what about data? And like, oh, data doesn't exist. And I'm like, how can an organization that's been here for a very long time, and a profession that's been here for a very long time, and we strive ourselves to being evidence-based, how come we don't even know who makes up the profession? And I think that just was a red flag on its own. It's like, do we not care about this? Who is not a priority? How can you serve a really diverse group and not know if there's diversity within? And if there isn't diversity within, I even question like, how are we learning cultural competence, cultural sensitivity training, humility? Like there's a lot of words for that as well. But like, yeah, how does that go into place? And you mentioned earlier about, are we causing harm? And things like that. And I think that goes back to like, at the end of the day, practicing client-centered care, patient-centered care. And at the end of the day, there's also the aspect of having that cultural piece, because you can't know how to talk to someone unless you have like that cultural aspect in place. So yeah, I've had discussions over the years, and more so I think last year I made, I wouldn't say a bit of a scene, that's how it's described by others. But for myself, I kind of just did it it was a voluntary survey, and I'm just like, well, everyone's in this room, whoever is here, not the whole profession for sure, but if you don't identify as being a member of like the Black, Indigenous people or people of color, or even being from the LGBTQ spectrum, like, please stand up. And who stood up? Again, it just indirectly asking and stating like for white cis women to stand up, and that just kind of painted a picture. And I'm like, this is a data survey I've been waiting for, I'm asking for, and we are long overdue for. So yeah, even having those conversations, they're tough. And sometimes I get asked or told like reverse racism does not exist. Also white fragility comes up, and that's when there's that defense, and there's a book about it by Robin DiAngelo, like, yeah, the being defensive of like, why are you bringing this up? And I think when those things come up, it's just like walls. Even as much as we're trying to talk about this and dismantle it, people start putting up walls, and we don't want to further talk about it. And I guess that's where protecting privilege comes into play. So yeah, it's so far, I guess, the conversation with Safeena and I, and that's just, it's funny. I talked to her. I'm like, I remember posting that one comment on one of your posts and being like, so you're doing this weight inclusive stuff. How do you take the cultural aspect? You know, like, I didn't think about that. And I'm like, okay, that's something to think about. And that's how we kind of became virtual friends. And with this recent stuff, and just me always bringing this up with my research, I just never, I don't know. It's always like, if you're good at doing something, don't do it for free. And you have to think about your value and your worth for sure. And I just feel like I've always contributed a lot. And also, yeah, asking for compensation. And that's something scary to do. And being like, well, if I ask for pay, they're going to find someone else that's not asking for pay. But what does that really say about the organization? And you really need to give back the value. And I understand like the board is voluntary for sure. But again, there's compensation, other forms for the board. They do get compensated when they travel and things like that, and for their meals and hotels. So it's just, honestly, I think right now I'm just asking for transparency. Everyone's asking for transparency. And we all deserve to be paid well as dietitians. And what really annoys me and is the fact that people are still asking, what does a dietitian do? What's the difference between a nutritionist? And it's true, like in different parts of Canada, that the term is kind of regulated, but not everywhere. I could say for Nova Scotia that is a protected title, nutritionist, but in Ontario, it's at the same time. I also question why do people still question this? If we can't move beyond what a dietitian does, it just, everything else is secondary. It's what's kind of like the whole point of us being in this profession, while other people are the so quote unquote nutrition experts and doing the same things. Or what value do we have? So I bring up a lot of things. It's like the race aspect for sure. It's thinking about our value as dietitians overall. And yeah, why do people not take us seriously? But also, do we even know who makes up the profession? If we don't know who makes up the profession, the other things are really secondary. So yeah, that's where all my like activism work and that type of stuff comes from. And also being mindful that I don't do this by myself, and I have like a really great support circle. And being at the Mount, the only other person I really do work with that I realize both of our theses kind of look at diversity in different aspects is Sephora. So Sephora is my classmate, roommate, friend, social support. Sometimes I say my emotional support worker. But you know, there's it wasn't until she also reminded me, she's like, you know, you're one of the few racialized people even here doing this work. And then when we thought of like, you know, reaching out nationally and seeing people doing work across Canada, students, we're like, wait, I think it's just us. And she had to remind me, and then I had to think about my privilege in that position and being like, yeah, that's, sometimes you're reminded, sometimes you forget, because there are other privileges that kind of block you from other things and support you in other ways. But yeah, there's not a lot of people doing this work, and we definitely need to do more of that and have these spaces and conversations, because it's great for me to have the support. But what about other people that really need it at their institutions or wherever they may be in Canada or elsewhere in the world.
Yes, I absolutely love that, Gurneet. Thank you so much. And what I am going to do is loop back again to your research, the research that you're doing, because I have a couple of questions around that, which I'm hoping you can speak to. Safeena, I'm wondering if you don't mind kind of rounding us off this part of our conversation, talking about, what are your hopes moving forward for how this statement might shift the needle even a little bit, not only for individuals, but then also more collectively as well?
Yeah, so we started with posting of our letters. We actually created the Dietetic Diversity campaign on Instagram. And so we had quite a few dietitians, both BIPOC and white allies, voice their opinions and their disappointment with the way that Dietitians of Canada handled the whole interaction. And so we had a conversation with Natalie Savoie, who is the CEO at the moment, and she was very receptive to the things that we had to say. And they do want to do things. There are just some limitations at the moment. But what we really wanted out of this was for them to create a BIPOC consultancy group. So we wanted them, instead of the board members and the leadership of Dietitians of Canada leading the efforts for diversity and inclusion, we wanted it to be by Black, Indigenous, and people of color for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That way we're incorporating those diverse perspectives, because right now it can be said that the organization is quite white, like almost all the people leading are, and even still the members on the board who are people of color are sort of tokenized for their background, which is very problematic in and of itself. And so we were really calling them into action to really take a hard, long think about why diversity is important and how they can move forward to have more inclusion in the organization. So as of right now, it seems like that's kind of on hold. I mean, as a national organization, they have many different priorities, but the hope is that this won't fizzle out. Gurneet actually has started the Dietetic Diversity Canada group, or Diversify
Dietetics, is it Canada?
Yes. Yeah, sorry, it just slipped my mind. So she started the Canadian chapter, but and so within that group, we're having conversations of how we can keep this momentum going. So we're really hoping to do more things in the future.
Yeah, you actually speak to something really important there, Safeena. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more, Gurneet, about Diversify Dietetics, the Canadian branch or chapter. You speak to something important, and that is keeping the momentum going, or really holding to account people who you are in communication with, because so often, especially in larger organizations, we see some valuable conversations, and we see interest, and we see investment, and then something else happens that effectively kind of steals attention or steals energy, and it kind of fizzles out. So I really look forward to having conversations with both of you down the track to see how we can, maintain this momentum, and that other organizations or members of other organizations, we can support each other as well, because there are lots of ways that maybe, British dietitians or Kiwi dietitians or Australian dietitians, we can look to other organizations and hold our own organizations accountable based on what others are doing too, so it can have a little bit more of a global effect as well. So Gurneet, do you mind telling us a little bit about Diversify Dietetics and how it's come to Canada?
Yeah, for sure, Fiona. So just thinking about where Diversify Dietetics started. So it started in the States by Tamara and Deanna, who are both Black dietitians, and I really came in contact with them kind of like through my thesis advisor, Jen Brady, because I was searching the stuff, and then I think it came to my attention because I'm like, oh, I see this organization. And she's like, oh, you should get in contact with them. So kind of came in contact with them, and we started conversations, and I got also involved with their mentorship program, and that's where I met Vinci. So that's where our paths crossed, and just having conversation with them and realizing we don't have this in Canada. And they do have chapters within the States in different, different cities and things like that. I'm like, it'd be cool to start something in Canada. So primarily it kind of started with a little bit of a working group. It was with myself. It was with Rosie here in Canada, and also Candace. So a couple of us kind of got into phone calls, and then also ultimately Sephora and I kind of started like the first meeting here that we had in Halifax, and it took place during Critical Dietetics Conference in October 2019. So we kind of have a closed space. So it took a little bit of a spin. I made it, although Diversify Dietetics focuses on racial and ethnic diversity, and it is all encompassing. So whoever wants to support this, whether they're allies, accomplices, whatever they like to name themselves, it's not just for racialized people. It's also opening, allowing people from privileged backgrounds, also white individuals, to kind of come and support. So, but for myself at that moment, I thought it was really important with everything going on to have a closed space. It didn't come easy. There was questions from white students and things like that, like, why can't we come? And usually their events are open. It's not like that. It's just, I really thought it was important to have that closed space. And from that, we kind of started this closed Facebook group. And then it wasn't until recently this year that we opened it up to just all Canada on Facebook. So whether you are racialized or not in dietetics, a student, a dietitian, intern, everyone's open to join, but we also recognize it might not be the most accessible because not everyone's on Facebook. So Sephora and I have just been like figuring out things in between of like how we can get different forums going. And yeah, that's just been general conversation, but it's a great virtual community. A lot of people post questions. A lot of people share different content, whether there's like anti-oppressive training, there's webinars. So it's like a really great self-education group, and having these conversations, because things in the States, they also have different associations. Like there's Black dietitian group, there's a Latinx group, and we don't have that in Canada at all. We don't have those groups. So when I told it to Deanna, and she's like, oh, you really have to like tailoring the material here is very different. Also thinking of a relationship with Indigenous people. So that's kind of like where we do tailor off a little bit differently. And for Sephora and I, it's voluntarily run, and we're also students and getting into this, but it's been great learning the ropes and getting our hands dirty in other ways. And also, like you learn by trial, and we never had this before. And this is where diverse conversations start. And we really need to support these spaces, and people really need to support back as well.
Yeah, that's amazing, Gurneet. So essentially you have been in active communication with the US-based Diversify Dietetics groups, and then have been able to set up your own more local chapter or affiliation with that, which really seeks to serve Black and Indigenous people of colour, but in Canada as well.
Yeah, and it's also like at the same time, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And if there's already groups doing that, it's like powering those groups, and at the same time powering the movements that are already happening, because it's really easy just to be like, I'm gonna start my own thing, but it's a lot to just start something from scratch as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And when your time and energy is being divided in about 100 different areas, then, working together and building on what already exists, even like you say, we're able to take what feels really resonant, and that shows up in a more multinational or in a global fashion, and then able to tailor that more for local communities as well. As an Australian, I do understand what you're talking about, where, if our anti-oppression work is very US-centric, there is, sure, a vast majority of it that does feel really relevant. But as a colonialized country, there are particular aspects of it that are really quite specific, even regionally specific in some ways. So that's the ongoing work for all of us. So just to finish us off, and this is probably kind of a big topic, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more about, over the past few months, there has been a real resurgence of critique of health at every size and what we name as weight-inclusive approaches. And certainly there's been a lot of call-ins and some call-outs as well with people who, dietitians and particularly dietitians and health professionals, health practitioners who name themselves as HAES aligned or weight inclusive, to be really digging into ways in which we are actively not including race and culture in our inclusivity work. So I'm so curious to hear your thoughts, no matter how processed or unprocessed they are. That doesn't, we're here just having a conversation with wherever we're at. So I'm just really curious to hear about your thoughts as to, your not only your lived experience, but also what you've read or heard or participated in conversations about, the evolution of this and your observations of our more recent conversations. So I guess I'll ask Safeena, if it's okay, what are your thoughts at the moment? Even just your opinions or your experiences. It doesn't all have to be in a perfect little processed box.
Thanks for the opportunity to discuss this. It's very timely. And I'm part of a number of weight-inclusive dietetic practitioner groups. And this is a conversation that I'm seeing take place. So just a little bit of a background on how I got into health at every size and weight inclusion work is my own experiences. As a child, I was chubby. So I would always hear sort of things about the way my body looked and what I needed to do. This really informed my own relationship with food and my issues with body image. And so I knew as a dietitian, I didn't want to perpetuate these types of notions, which is why I started reading Health at Every Size by Lindo Bacon for a professional development project last fall. And so it was really nice for me to finally find a framework that I felt aligned with my values and the kind of advice and recommendations that I wanted to provide and the kind of care that I wanted to provide for my future clients. And for me, where I can see the limitations, aside from all that Lucy Affermore has talked about and other dietitians and fat activists have discussed, is when Gurneet asked me, I had made a post, and she asked me, how are you talking about health at every size from your perspective as a South Asian woman? And I said, that's difficult. I haven't thought about that. And I definitely didn't do that in my presentation because I didn't think that it needed to be done. But then the more I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it, I couldn't reconcile my cultural identity and health at every size. The two didn't just fit. And there's two reasons for that. One being the framework of how HAES came to be, which is it took from the fat acceptance movement, or rather fat liberation movement that started in the 70s. And it repackaged all those ideas that were by fat people, for fat people, and then it put this nice image of thin women at the forefront of the movement. So effectively, it erased the people that were trying to be liberated. And then the second piece is that in South Asian culture, and more specifically, I'll speak from the Indo-Guyanese perspective, is that you need to look a certain way. So your breasts need to be full, you need to have curves, but you can't have too much fat, have a nice bum. These are all standards that were created and taken from different parts of the world and are ultimately shaped by the results of colonialism. And so because of my own childhood experiences of the way my body was viewed, and that sort of cultural norm, it was really hard for me to put the two together. And ultimately, I think that this resurgence of criticism of health at every size is going to move us in a positive direction, because there are intersectional dietetic students and dietitians such as myself and Gurneet who know how the current framework can sort of oppress people of different groups. And then we can use our own experiences and the tools that we have at our disposal to maybe take from these weight-inclusive approaches, but create something entirely different that might, that'll be more applicable to a variety of populations. Of course, no one framework is going to be perfect and going to work well for every single population, but hopefully in the future we'll be conducting research that'll be able to be more inclusive.
Sounds like you've got a PhD already set up there, Safeena, for yourself.
Hopefully in the future.
Yay, that sounds great. Another how many years of your life?
I know. I'm just hoping to start my dietetic career and then we'll revisit the PhD idea.
Okay, that sounds good. I'll loop back to you maybe in 5 years' time and just see how you settled into that idea.
For sure.
Gurneet, I'm really curious to hear from your perspective, also given that, you were the one who gave Safeena the nudge around, this is really interesting. So how are you, what is this utility, through your own lived experience, cultural lens? So over to you.
Yeah, and even thinking back to when I did comment on Safeena's post, and this goes back, I guess, this January, but even before that, when I first got into the master's at the Mount, and just talking to Sephora again, we would talk about a lot of different things in nutrition, and I guess also both being racialized and we were living in the same dorm. That was the first time we really heard about HAES and hearing about weight-inclusive practice, and we just had a frank discussion. I'm like, so how, it just really went back to like, okay, we're learning this. It seems great in theory, but can we talk to our parents about this? And we both laughed, and it was like over tea and stuff like that. And we had many conversations. Like, we tried to figure out like, so how can I tell my mom I'm okay with my body? Or do you just say like, this is just how we're born, or this is how our ancestors were about, like both. And then also noting that Sephora and I are both, we're both South Asian. She's born in India. My parents are from India, but they're from North India, and Sephora's from South India. So again, different size variations each way. And also, I should have done this earlier, just like as Safeena talked about being Indo-Guyanese, I am South Asian descent, and more so identify as being Punjabi, and then religiously being Sikh. So, and then when cultural aspect and religion kind of comes into that play, it's a lot of things, a lot of intersections, like thinking about the shape of your body, thinking also about skin color, because then colorism comes into play. And being where my parents immigrated from, being in Punjab, and it's been colonized, and India's been colonized, and also with the partition with Pakistan on the side. So it's gone through, and then also considering, it's going to get heavy too, considering like the other cultural genocide, when I think back to the Sikh community in 1984, and that's other things on its own, but there's a lot of displacement, there's a lot of intercultural trauma that's happened, and what is the ideal body? And I've learned from like a young age that it's being thin, it's being lighter in skin, and I just so happened to be born like that, and also being lighter in skin, being South Asian and also Punjabi. So those are always things in my favor. And I think it's even like most recently when I always come back home and I'm traveling and doing things. Again, your body changes with where you are in your life and also being a woman, and there's a lot of things. So you do hear comments like, you look like you gained some weight, or it looks like you're not eating a lot. And then when you hear these comments, and Sephora and I'd always talk about it, it's like, these are ways that people in our community like show care and be like, oh, I don't think you've eaten, or you seem like you're eating a lot, take care of yourself. But when you do translate it over, it does again come from a colonial place of like, you're not, kind of quote unquote telling you like your body is not right, there's something wrong with you type of thing. So like those have been difficult. And most recently I did have a conversation with my parents about, this is just what my body is, you're saying this about me, that type of stuff. And it didn't go over well. And I told this to many people, mostly my racialized like dietetic professional friends, and it's like, well, that's kind of courageous that you try to do that. I'm like, that was a very long conversation, just seeing how it kind of went on. But there, again, when we talk about this, there's a lot to unpack, and it goes back to having that client-centered care approach. And you really need to treat people the way they want to be treated versus the way you want to be treated, because that's what it comes at the end. And also, what I've seen, and just being with a lot of people that researching this, and they just so happen to be white, I feel like that's something to even talk about. Like, we do have our own values that we hold, but at the same time, if someone's coming to us, that's always controversial. Someone comes and like, you're a dietitian or a dietetic intern, I want to lose weight. And just because you don't want to do that, or you don't believe in that in other ways, you have to really understand where that person's coming from and what are they really looking for. And if they come and then they spend a lot of money and they're like, this is not what I want, I'm going to go and get like bariatric surgery, I'm going to go to someone else. And it's a heavy, a lot of things to unpack. It's really heavy, but we really do need to have those conversations. And that's where client-centered care really needs to be in the center of it. And we need to understand at the end of the day, it's what the client wants. It's not what we want. We can obviously hold those values, but if someone's coming to us and if we can't do that, it's a really good idea just to refer to someone else that can support them, because that's whatever is within your scope. And if it's not within your scope, referring over, and that's really important to do versus causing trauma and making someone feel like, oh, no, I can't eat this, or now my body is okay. And then also, this is a huge thing. This is maybe why it's a little bit difficult to even have these conversations, different cultural groups, like Safeena brought up earlier with being South Asian descent, and within different groups, the high rates of diabetes. And also I'm thinking about cardiovascular disease, and even like what I'm kind of, I guess, what kind of runs in my family as well, right? So thinking about that, and if there is excess fat, or there is fat in certain parts of my body, and then it puts me at a higher risk. I could say I'm happy with my body, it's okay, but if it is going to cause harm, like later on or even now, that's something to consider. It's not just being happy with that. What if you're happy with harm being caused, and versus really understanding? Then it just brings up like there's a lot to unpack for sure, and I don't even know the answer how to do this cultural weight inclusive practice yet, but really interested to see like what others are doing and learn more about that, because I never really dove into it. And I think I never dove into it based on the conversations Sephora and I have and other people, because it always just seemed the people that are having conversations are mostly white women. And again, thinking back to history, it starts from from racialized women and fat liberation. But yeah, when you don't see people like yourselves talking about that, it's difficult to be like, how can this be applied to this group, or how have you thought about that? And that's where the lived experience is really important, and meeting people where they're at. And it's great to just start this conversation here, because yeah, it is a touchy subject. Not everyone wants to talk about it. And us even talking about it now, like just being students and trying to figure out the loops and stuff like that. Yeah, BMI is its own thing, right? Like there's so much to unpack, and it's just being open to just unpacking it together. And I think that's the steps that the profession really needs to take to understand the trauma that has been caused, and how can we undo trauma and really, pave a better future that's equity based and also inclusive. And what does that mean, and what does that look like, and how do we get there? You don't know until you start and kind of get dirty, kind of figuring out the loops and everything as well.
Yes, I love that. Yes, getting in there together and having some of those dirty messy, mucky conversations that ultimately, I think one of the errors that we sometimes make, and this is a kind of a collective error, is that where we have these conversations to get somewhere or to have answers. And I'm not sure about you two, but I'm very late to the game in this after having 20 years of practice behind me. But, the sense of acceptance around, what if we were to have conversations to be keeping ethical practice at the core? What if we were to be having these conversations to be serving the people who we say we are serving at the core, as opposed to have answers or to get somewhere? So, anyway, that's a little bit of my rant. But what I really appreciate, Gurneet, about what you just spoke about is understanding how even the very frameworks, let's just say health at every size is a very broad framework, or non-diet approaches, being the multiplicity, which includes things like intuitive eating, for example, or Lucy Aframore's Well Now type of framework, that all of these kind of non-diet approaches, they none of them can possibly even incorporate every single person's experience. And what you really spoke to there, Gurneet, so beautifully, is understanding the reasons, that the lived experience and highly, highly valid reasons why people might have desires to be changing their body, which is deeply rooted often in white supremacy. It's often rooted in power structures and people's capacities to have any kind of voice in the world. So not only racialized peoples, but then also non-binary folks, folks from LGBTQ communities, and reasons why people feel, due to their lived experience in this world, why changing their body would lead to a better quality of life, and for us to be able to leave to the side our own fairly narrow opinions, maybe, to be able to concentrate on the person in front of us and how we might serve them best. And I really appreciated what you said, Gurneet, about if we have, I call it, for me, my line in the sand, and that is the conversations that I'm willing to have, and then the practice that I'm willing to enact, let's just say. So I will often say to my students, look, I'm not going to be the person who's going to do the shake program, for example, with somebody, but what I will do is I am more than happy to engage in conversations around to hold an empathic and compassionate space for people to explore the way in which they have experienced their body, which has led them here to me today, and then to find someone suitable who can hold a space where where their desires can be supported with behaviours. So if that's not me, then I will find you somebody who can hold that space for you in a way that serves your purpose. Was that kind of what you were talking about, Gurneet?
Yeah, like for sure. Like if that's not the service you provide, or at the same time being mindful of the person's time and effort and money, what they're spending. It's like these are the options that I do offer, but if you want to go into the other route, like when you're kind of, I don't know, like choosing, buying a car, I don't know, picking up clothes, like trying to choose where to eat, like there's a lot of pros and cons. So it's like listing things out. At the end of the day, it's the person's choice what they want to do and where they want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So, okay. Oh my gosh. I could talk to you two for literally hours, right? Because you are such actually you're a wealth of wisdom more than anything else. And I personally don't believe wisdom comes with years. I believe wisdom comes with lived experience and a capacity and a willingness to explore ideas that live within us. So I want to honor your experience, no matter how, no matter the years of life that you have lived in this world and the wisdom that you have brought to this conversation today. I'm just incredibly appreciative to you both. So just to kind of round us off, I wanted to offer both of you an opportunity to put anything on the table, on this collective table that we have created together today, that you feel like maybe we've missed, or oh gosh, we've missed 50 million things, haven't we? But anything that you would like to offer, in us kind of closing up today. So Safeena, enormous gratitude to you. Is there anything that you would like to kind of offer to us today in terms of, people to go and listen to, organisations to support, things that we, that you would have loved to have talked about?
Yeah, so when speaking about the whole health at every size and the supremacy within that, and sort of the origins of the fat liberation movement, I also forgot at the moment to mention that within various cultures, they have their own standards of beauty. And in some cultures, fat is beautiful. It's, seen as a sign of fertility and wealth and all of these different positive associations that we don't have here in the West. And so with that, I'd like to add, without taking from culture, but more from an appreciative perspective, and to put people on wonderful women who are doing the same work, is that in Black culture, women are very appreciative of their bodies. The whole body positivity movement sort of arised out of their self-love and really caring for themselves in a world that hasn't been kind to them because of their intersecting identities. And Kimberly Crenshaw, a critical race theory scholar, does an excellent job of highlighting the different ways in which Black women are oppressed. And so body positivity was a way for them to overcome that. So I want to put the spotlight on a few Black women who are doing amazing work in the area of body positivity and liberation, including Safeena Jabar, who does a lot of work in the area, and I believe she's also a lifestyle and fashion blogger. Huntle Shackelford, who writes articles, various articles about body positivity, as well as Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote The Body is Not an Apology. She regularly does IGTVs and dives into all these different areas, and she's so well spoken, and she's so able to put the thoughts that we have swirling in our head and, put a name to it and talk about why we need to address it, and providing those solid calls to action, which we need to all apply into our own lives. There's also Sabrina Strings, who wrote the Fearing the Black Body, the Racist Origins of Fat Phobia. So these are wonderful women to look to and learn from, as I really want to be mindful, not erasing the work of those who have laid the ground, so to speak, for me to be here. And also just sort of closing off that, as healthcare practitioners, privilege is something we can't just kind of look at the social determinants of health and say, all right, check, 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 we're done. There's so much more to it. And so we really need to be mindful of the implications it has for the people we work with. And even the medical establishment itself is created as a result of colonization and capitalism. So we look at how recently in the news, there's been talk about how the father of modern gynecology performed experiments on Black women without anesthesia, without pain medication, because his belief was that they couldn't feel pain. This is actually a belief that Black people do not feel pain. There was also the birth control trials in Puerto Rico and Haiti. There were the nutrition experiments that took place in residential schools, which actually provided the data that we have today for the recommended daily intakes. And so we really need to be mindful. Our discipline is very rooted in the oppression of people from non-dominant groups. And so 2 exercises that I suggest. The first is Peggy McIntosh's Extending the Knapsack. And Fee, it would be wonderful if you could provide the link to this. Just to briefly summarize, it's sort of a 1-hour activity where people work in pairs and they're posed different questions and really asked to think about the privilege that they experience. And so an exercise that I myself have done, and well, I don't know if I'm the original creator, so I won't take credit for that, but it was something that I thought of as doing the social determinants of health exercise. So print out any model of the determinants of health that you think you like best, and under each category, sort of use a traffic light system, whether green means like you're good, you face no barriers, yellow means, yeah, you might face some barriers, but nothing that severely hinders your ability to pursue healthcare, and then red meaning that there are serious barriers and limitations to this area. And this will really provide us with a picture of our own positionality. And I know Gurneet herself has done the flower power, I believe it's called. I may be saying that incorrectly. Gurneet, if you want to step in on that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. That was something we were doing in our other youth group, and I brought that up as a nice way to like talk about intersectionality. So it's pretty much, yeah, it was just like something I found on the website, but literally what it is, you kind of put your name in the middle and thinking about Kimberly Crenshaw intersectionality, searching that up. And it just, because it's summer, I thought this was fun to do with our youth group. It's like you make the petals and you kind of write down like, yeah, what about race? What about income? What about language, citizenship? All those other intersections that you have, and maybe you'll end up making lots of bouquets. That's also, it can end up that way because intersectionality can go on forever and a lot to unpack. So that's definitely something to look into. And then I'm thinking about the social location wheel activity, and that's something I learned from Suzanne, who's actually a Black woman I met through meal exchange at an event, and we just been in contact, and she's in the States becoming a social worker. And also myself, it's important for me to credit that I'm able to do this work, and I do have that privilege and benefiting from that. But at the same time, crediting Black women specifically who have allowed me to be educated about things at their own expense at times. And thinking about Diversify Dietetics with Tamara and Deanna, who are both Black women, thinking about one of my friends who's known for like probably since I started my master, just being connected with her, Rosie Mencha, the Rosie nutritionist, that we've always had very extensive conversations about racism and health. And she's also looking into doing her private practice that she started and looking at like weight inclusive practice and body positivity. What does it mean to her and her community? And someone else that I've been connected with is Julia, who's nutrition positive. Can't say her last name because I can't say that accent aigus en français for that. But that's someone I've been connected with, and I believe she's in Montreal in Canada here. And it's great to see the work that she's doing. And yeah, we really do need to give credit where credit's due. And that's what I feel like that's really missing in dietetics when it comes to, there's obviously pictures of people smiling with salads and diverse images of what multiculturalism means in Canada and all these infographics for sure, but it's like giving voice to the people is really important. And that's what I'm trying to do with like my research, getting the counter stories. So I always say, these are not the stories, these are not the testimonials you're going to see on websites, because those are the hard truths that people face, the emotional, it's very emotional, it's very heavy, and it's things that we do really need to listen to. So I really hope that individuals who are listening and professional organizations, institutes, really take the time to everyone's saying the reflecting, thinking, and reading, but what about doing? That's what everyone's waiting for. We don't need any more moments of silence. We need action. And it just brings, this is like a funny point that I bring up, but it's actually a true point in a way. When I think back to colonization and being from, my parents are from India, immigrated from there. So thinking like the colonizers just didn't come and say, we're going to do this, and then we'll give you tonight to think about it, whether you like it or not, then whatever happens, right? It just happened, and it was very abrupt. And also thinking about slavery, it was very abrupt. It was unconsensual. It just happened because whoever had power. So understanding that these systems have been in place for many years, it's going to take many years to undo the harm, but it starts from just accepting that this is reality, this is what it is, naming names, not going around the bush of not saying racism, not saying this. Like, things need to be named. White supremacy needs to be named. White privilege, racism needs to be named. And until we name things, we can't move forward. And I really feel like this is a turning point, and these things have been happening before COVID, and that also comes up with discussion, grounding ourselves like this just didn't happen because COVID-19 happened in the world. These just things emerged because you can really figure out who's privileged and who's not privileged, and that's where who's benefiting and who's losing out, and who's dying and who's surviving, like who's thriving and who's surviving for sure. And I guess that's something that we really need to think about introspectively and really start practicing, instead of telling individuals, I'm listening, it's going to happen, just wait on it. We need to see progress. Things can happen overnight. We saw the government starting to offer funding so overnight. And these are people at the same time saying it's going to take months and months of consultation. If governments and everyone's being held accountable, things can happen quickly, and you can take those steps. And just like how Safeena and I, in the beginning, were like, there might be missteps, there might be mistakes. I think just being open and honest about that is really important, and that's how we can move forward with having these difficult conversations, and also sitting in discomfort, which is really important as well.
Thank you so much, Gurneet. What an amazing finale to this really incredibly important conversation. I am so appreciative and grateful to you both for your time, for your energy, as I said, your wisdom. Nothing to do with years in practice, nothing to do with years in this world, but that your generosity will be echoed through the generations of dietitians to come. And I really look forward to staying in touch with you. Again, thank you so much for being such incredible voices in our profession and in the world. And I'm very excited to see where these conversations are leading us. And as Gurneet reminds us, that contemplation and conversations and thinking, etc., can only come to light and can only make a difference when we follow that up with action. So I'm going to be taking that with me as well. Thank you, Gurneet, and thank you, Safeena, so much again for being here. And yes, again, look forward to being in touch with you.
Thank you for providing the space for us in order to talk about these very heavy topics, albeit necessary given the current social climate. And, we can all learn from each other. As you said, like, age doesn't equal wisdom. It's about, really thinking and reflecting upon these things and then putting them into action. It's been a pleasure,
sure.
Fiona.
I would say the same, and I really look forward to other people reclaiming space, taking up space, and being on these platforms and being, equitably compensated and having these discussions, because we need to have more of it, and thinking about, really thinking about that and what that means beyond just one conversation. It leads to many conversations.
Oh yeah, that would be my hope for this conversation that the three of us have had together, which actually feels like we're, sitting down and having cups of tea together. It has very much felt like that. And I hope in the future that we can do that in person. That would be my dream. And my second dream is that people who are listening are able to really let a lot of these ideas land and move forward into action from contemplation. So again, I'm incredibly grateful to you both. Thank you. Well, that's our episode of the Mindful Dietitian interview series for today. Thank you so much to our wonderful guest and to you for listening. I really hope you enjoyed it. Just a reminder that you can find me over on the website www.themindfuldietitian.com.au, and please join actually quite a large group of wonderful and enthusiastic dietitians on the closed Facebook group, The Mindful Dietitian. The music you hear is called Happiness from Ben Sound, used under the Creative Commons license. Have a great day, everyone.